was an ordinary Wednesday when Jenna found herself walking into the Oakwood grocery store. The sky was overcast, clouds swirling in hues of gray and purple, signaling the arrival of a storm. Jenna had been to this store 1,000 times before. It was quiet, predictable, and safe, a place to get the week's essentials and leave without much fuss. But today was different. She didn't know why. It was just a feeling, a strange, unsettling vibe that clung to the air like static, making her skin crawl. Still, she shrugged it off, stepping into the cool, dimly lit store. As she passed through the sliding glass doors, the familiar scent of stale bread and canned soup greeted her, but it seemed heavier today. The hum of the fluorescent lights above her seemed unnaturally loud, buzzing in a way that made her teeth clench. She was alone, or so it seemed. The aisles were quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. She didn't see any employees. No one behind the register. No one restocking shelves. It was as though the store had been abandoned. Yet every product was in place, each box and can carefully arranged as if waiting for customers to purchase them. Jenna made her way to the produce section, her sneakers tapping lightly against the floor. The fruits and vegetables were fresh, as they always were, but today they seemed oddly vibrant. The apples were too red, the bananas too yellow, and the cucumbers almost glowing under the harsh light. She reached for a pear, its skin smooth and glossy, but as her fingers brushed against it, she felt a cold shiver run up her spine. The pear was ice cold, much colder than it should have been. She pulled her hand back, heart racing. What the hell? She thought, glancing around. No one was there. The feeling intensified as she turned down the next aisle. The air was thicker now, heavier, as though the space itself was pressing in on her, suffocating her with its stillness. A sudden gust of wind whistled through the ceiling vents, making the overhead lights flicker. Jenna looked up, her heart skipping a beat, as she noticed that one of the lights was buzzing louder than the others. It flickered once more, then went out with a sharp pop, leaving the aisle in near total darkness. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, staring at the faint silhouette of the empty shelves in front of her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she instinctively pulled it out, but the screen was blank. No notifications, just a black screen staring back at her. Then she heard it, a soft sound, like footsteps. But there was no one there. She turned her head sharply, scanning the aisles to her left and right. Empty. The cold air stirred again, sending a shiver down her spine. Her breath quickened, a growing sense of unease sinking in. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her nerves. It's fine. It's just a quiet day at the store, that's all. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were behind her now. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Jenna took a step forward, her shoes tapping against the linoleum, but the sound of the footsteps followed her, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing behind her, just out of sight. Her pulse raced, her skin flushing with anxiety. She reached the end of the aisle, quickly turning into the next. The footsteps did the same. Her breath caught in her throat as she broke into a light jog, rounding the corner, only to be met with a sudden, sharp clank. A metal shopping cart. The cart was just sitting there in the middle of the aisle, unmoving, as though someone had abandoned it hastily. But the strange thing was, there was no one near it. There were no signs of anyone having been around it. It was as if the cart had simply appeared, sitting there as an eerie omen. Jenna felt her heart hammer in her chest. She stood there, staring at the cart, her mind racing. Is this some kind of prank? She thought. Was someone playing a joke on her? She stepped forward cautiously, her hand reaching toward the cart. As she touched the cold metal frame, she heard it again, the footsteps. Only this time, they were not behind her. They were ahead, in the next aisle, coming closer. Her heart stopped. Her hand gripped the cart tightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned, her eyes scanning the aisle in front of her, but there was no one there. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her. And then, bang! A can of beans fell from a nearby shelf, landing with a heavy thud on the floor. She jumped back, her body going rigid with fear. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the store had turned into a maze of shadows and empty spaces. Every aisle seemed endless, like the walls were shifting around her. She couldn't take it anymore. She turned and sprinted for the exit, but as she neared the sliding glass doors, they didn't open. Her fingers fumbled over the handle, panic rising in her chest. She pulled harder, but the doors were stuck, like they had been sealed shut. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned around, her eyes desperately searching for another way out. That's when she saw it, a figure standing at the end of the aisle. It was tall, its shape dark and indistinct, but there was something wrong with it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her. It was as though it didn't belong there, like it had no right to be in this world. It was not a person, not anymore. The way its outline seemed to warp and shift, the way its very presence seemed to bend reality, made it clear. This was no ordinary figure. Jenna felt her stomach twist with terror. Her breath was caught in her throat, her chest constricting, as if the air itself had turned toxic. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move. But somehow, she knew that it was watching her, studying her every movement. Then, the lights flickered again, and the figure was gone, just as suddenly as it had appeared. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, the footsteps again, closer, louder, more insistent. She backed away from the door, desperate to escape. But no matter where she turned, the shadows seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. And with every passing second, she felt something ancient, something evil, drawing nearer. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, waiting for her. Jenna's mind raced, every rational thought slipping away. There was no escape, no one to help her. She had to get out. She had to leave. And that was when the store's lights went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. This is the opening sequence of the story, designed to build tension and suspense. It sets the stage for what follows, with eerie, unexplained events in a familiar setting. The story will progress as Jenna uncovers more about the horrors within the store and her eventual escape, or not. The darkness was thick, suffocating. Jenna stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs, every nerve in her body screaming for escape. But she couldn't move. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear, her breath ragged as she tried to steady herself. The oppressive silence in the store felt like it was wrapping around her, choking her, making it hard to think, to breathe. The lights flickered again, once, twice, before they completely went out, leaving her standing in total blackness. The only sound now was the rapid thud of her heartbeat. She could feel it, Something was in the store with her. Something watching her. She could feel its presence, the weight of its eyes, even though she couldn't see it. The footsteps had stopped, but in their place there was something far worse, an eerie, almost imperceptible sound, like the creaking of old wood, the scrape of nails against metal, faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions, swirling in the dark. Was it real? Jenna asked herself, the question echoing in her mind. Was she just imagining all of this? Her rational mind screamed for her to snap out of it, to tell herself it was just a prank, maybe an electrical malfunction. But deep down, she knew. She knew this was no coincidence. The feeling of being watched, the footsteps, the cold, it was real. She shakily reached for her phone again, but it was still dead. The screen remained blank, unresponsive. With trembling hands, she shoved it back into her pocket and wiped the sweat from her brow. Her mind raced, every worst-case scenario playing out like a movie. What was happening to her? What was in here with her? Her senses felt heightened, as if the darkness itself was feeding on her fear. She could hear every little sound, the faint rustling of bags, the drip of water somewhere far away, the low hum of something or someone moving in the aisles. Her feet moved without thought, her body jerking into motion as she stumbled forward, her arms extended in front of her, desperately searching for something, anything, to guide her through the maze of aisles. Her fingers brushed against cold shelves, glass bottles, and boxes of pasta. But the smell had changed. It was sour now, rank, like rotting meat, and the air was thicker than before, harder to breathe. Why couldn't she find the door? She felt like she had been walking for hours, her feet dragging, her pulse pounding in her throat. But the sliding glass doors, the exit, were still nowhere to be found. She spun around, her breath coming out in panicked gasps. But the store seemed to stretch endlessly, the aisles wrapping around her in an impossible way. It was as if the store itself was shifting, changing, like a twisted version of the world she had known. And then, suddenly, a soft voice broke through the silence, so faint she almost didn't hear it at first. "Help me." It was a whisper, soft and raspy, but unmistakably clear. It came from behind her, from somewhere deep within the aisles. Jenna froze, her body stiffening with fear, her eyes wide in the darkness, her breath caught in her throat. The voice, it was too quiet to be a real person. It sounded hollow, distant, like it had come from somewhere far away. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned toward the sound, but the darkness swallowed everything, leaving her blind. "Help me, please." The voice came again, closer this time. Jenna's heart nearly leapt out of her chest. Her body froze, as if some primal instinct had taken over, urging her to run, to hide. But her legs wouldn't obey. She could feel it, the presence of something moving toward her, something that wasn't quite human. The air turned colder, and her breath became visible in the freezing darkness, like mist hanging in the air. The voice came again, more insistent now, and this time it was followed by another sound, a soft, dragging noise, like someone slowly crawling across the floor, inching closer and closer to her. A shiver ran down Jenna's spine. She slowly, cautiously, reached for the nearest shelf, gripping the edge with white knuckles. Her heart pounded in her chest, so loud it almost drowned out the sound of the crawling, or whatever it was. Without thinking, her legs finally responded, and she bolted forward, stumbling over the cold tiles. her feet slipping, her body shaking with fear. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from that noise, away from whatever was in the store with her. But the more she ran, the further the exit seemed. The aisles seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, every turn, only leading to more shelves, more darkness, more horror. She was lost, trapped. Her breathing became erratic, each inhale sharp, shallow. Her feet ached, and her throat burned. But she couldn't stop, not now. Her eyes darted frantically around, searching for a way out. But the store seemed to be closing in on her. The shelves towered above her, like towering walls, blocking her view of everything. And then, in the distance, she saw it, a figure, moving between the aisles. It was tall, its outline blurry, its form shadowed and distorted, but there was no mistaking it. It was watching her, and it was getting closer. The footsteps echoed again, louder now, as if something was running after her. Jenna's legs felt like they were made of lead, but she pushed herself harder, rounding the corner into another aisle. Her eyes darted around, desperate for a way to escape. But everything felt wrong. The walls felt too close, the ceiling too low. It was as if the very store itself had turned against her, enclosing her in an endless loop. She had no way of knowing which direction was the right one. She was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, fast, relentless. She whipped around, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. The aisle behind her was empty, but the sound, it was still there, louder now. She took a step back, but before she could turn, the shelves on her left suddenly moved. She heard them scrape against the floor, as if something, or someone, was pushing them. Her stomach dropped as she realized the walls of the store were shifting around her, closing in, tightening like a vice. She turned on her heels and ran, but the aisles seemed to go on forever, stretching out like an infinite maze of shadows and twisted paths. Her breathing was ragged now, panicked, her vision blurring from the tears welling in her eyes. Suddenly, she was face to face with something, a person, or what used to be a person. It was hunched over, its body bent at an unnatural angle, skin pale and cracked, eyes hollowed out. It looked like it had been decaying for years, but its gaze was sharp, fixated on her. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Jenna knew it was waiting for her to make the wrong move. I have to run. The thought surged through her mind like a bolt of lightning. She sprinted past it, her chest heaving, her limbs burning with exertion. And for a moment, she thought she was free. The sound of the footsteps was gone. She thought she was safe. But then, as she rounded another corner, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The exit. It was there, but it was sealed shut. Thick chains wrapped around the glass doors. The locks rusted and caked with dust. The store was trapping her, keeping her inside, and she knew deep down that it wasn't going to let her go. With a sense of hopelessness gnawing at her soul, Jenna turned around, and there it was, the figure. It was standing right behind her. This time, it wasn't alone. Jenna's heart stopped. The figure behind her moved in a slow, deliberate manner. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, twisted in a way that defied human anatomy. The skin on its face was stretched tight, pulled in grotesque directions, revealing raw, gaping wounds beneath. The smell, decay and rot, filled the air, suffocating her as it moved closer. Its eyes, black and empty, locked onto her, and in them, she saw nothing but endless hunger. She could feel it, the presence of something far beyond human, something old, something ancient. It wasn't just haunting the store, it was the store. The walls, the aisles, the shelves, they were all part of it, alive, feeding off her terror. The air grew thicker, the darkness swallowing everything around her, like a living, breathing thing. Jenna's legs were frozen, her body trapped in an invisible vice, unable to move, unable to breathe. The world seemed to spin around her, the sound of her heartbeat deafening, pulsing through her veins, and the only thing that mattered was that thing, moving toward her, each step dragging across the floor like nails scraping against a chalkboard. Her breath caught in her throat as the creature reached out, its bony fingers brushing the back of her neck. She didn't dare turn around, didn't dare look at it directly. She could feel the cold emanating from it, the icy touch seeping through her skin, sending a wave of nausea through her entire body. But she couldn't move. She couldn't run. Not anymore. "Help me. Please. Help me," the voice whispered again. It was faint, like the sound of the wind through cracks in a window, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from all around her, wrapping itself around her mind, clawing at her sanity. It wasn't just the creature, it was the store itself. The curse. She had been drawn into it, into something she could never escape. With a final, guttural groan, the creature's long, skeletal hand curled around her wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. Her skin burned where it touched her, a searing cold that spread through her body, freezing her in place. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She tried to fight back, but her body was no longer her own. The store, the creature, the curse, it had all taken her. Her mind raced as she struggled to break free, but she knew it was pointless. She was trapped. The very store was closing in on her, the aisles narrowing, like walls closing in on a prisoner, and all she could do was stand there, frozen, as it consumed her. The creature's fingers dug deeper into her wrist, twisting, pulling her closer to it. Its black eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and Jenna could feel her consciousness slipping away, sinking into the abyss with each passing second. The store was feeding on her fear, on her despair. It had been waiting for her, drawing her in with the same irresistible pull that had trapped so many others before her. Then, in the darkness, something shifted. A distant sound, a thud, a scrape. Jenna's breath hitched. She wasn't alone. The creature wasn't the only one here. There was something else. Something watching, something waiting. A shadow flickered in the corner of her eye. Jenna forced herself to turn, her muscles screaming in protest, her body moving against its own will. And there, standing at the far end of the aisle, was a figure. It was human. At least, it looked human. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. But there was something wrong about him, something unnatural. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and his mouth hung open in a grotesque smile. "Don't trust it," the man whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "It wants you. It wants all of us." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to ask him who he was, what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. The creature behind her gave an angry hiss, as if it could sense her attention elsewhere, and with one swift motion, it pulled her back into its grasp, dragging her toward the dark corner of the store. "No, please," Jenna screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. But the creature's grip tightened, and she was helpless to stop it. Her feet slid across the cold floor as she was pulled through the aisles, the shelves towering around her like ominous sentinels, trapping her further in the endless maze of terror. The store was no longer just a place. It was a living nightmare, a twisted version of reality that bent and shifted to its will. The man in the corner of her vision moved closer, but his steps were slow, almost mechanical. He wasn't walking. He was dragging himself toward her, inch by inch. His legs were bent at impossible angles, twisted and broken, and as he drew nearer, the stench of decay grew stronger. But he wasn't like the creature. No, there was something different about him, something familiar. His face was a hollow, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. This man, he was one of the store's victims. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with unspeakable sorrow. He mouthed something she couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning. "Run," he seemed to say, but it was too late. With a final, agonizing scream, Jenna was yanked into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the man's face, twisted in pain, before the darkness swallowed her whole. The store was silent again, save for the faint sound of the flickering lights. Jenna was gone. The curse had claimed another soul. The shelves creaked, and the aisles shifted once more, as if the store itself was alive, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim. And in the dark corners of the store, deep beneath the aisles, where the shadows pooled like ink, something stirred. It was patient, it was hungry, and it was always watching. The doors would never open, not for anyone,